A faint plea for forgiveness echoed out of the encroaching darkness. Silence blanketed the void as life seemingly began to slip away. Confusion swirled as the lingering question of why hung heavily in the air. Shock jolted through Katlia as she realized she had been stabbed, frantically wondering who could possibly be apologizing to her. Fierce fury ignited within her, completely rejecting any notion of offering forgiveness to her unseen assassin. This is the tragic, untold story of how Katlia Bardo fought relentlessly until the night of her happy wedding. Exactly 1 month earlier, Katlia's ordinary life had abruptly derailed. Her stern father presented her with a staggering proposal to marry the prestigious Duke Cryaseld Vroj. Stunned beyond belief, she could only stare at him in utter bewilderment. Panic set in as her father firmly insisted that the powerful ducal family had aggressively requested this specific union. Desperately questioning the absurdity of it all, she pointed out the impossibly massive gap in status between their two families. Even an isolated country girl like Katlia knew the Vroj family boasted immense wealth, unparalleled honor, and the famously handsome Lord Cryaseld. In stark contrast, the Bardo clan was merely a small, provincial house of muscle-brained warriors descended from rugged mercenaries. Flashes of her chaotic, combat-oriented upbringing surged through her mind. As a fiery child, young Katlia had eagerly declared her dream of becoming a heroic female knight just like her grandmother. That innocent ambition, however, was quickly met with an unbreakable wall of resistance. Her father strictly shattered her hopes, outright forbidding her from ever practicing any form of martial arts. Shocked by the harsh decree, Katlia learned that this ban was actually the absolute final wish of her late mother and grandmother. They had envisioned a different, refined path for her, wanting her to abandon the sword and embrace the changing times to become a wonderful lady. The entire warrior family fiercely united behind this singular goal, committing to raise her strictly as a proper noblewoman. Katlia accepted their heavy expectations, knowing they genuinely believed a traditional, happy marriage would bring her far more joy than a brutal life of battle. However, being raised by a powerful, heroic, and relentlessly workaholic father made cultivating elegance nearly impossible. Surrounded by hulking, intense older brothers who constantly trained, she struggled immensely to fit the delicate mold expected of her. Growing up amid such explosive physical energy, she developed a massive appetite without ever gaining a single pound. Despite her family's absolute best efforts, Katlia turned out nothing like a refined young lady raised in quiet seclusion. She viewed her appearance critically, noting her plain brown hair, suntanned skin, and utterly ordinary eyes. Even her relatives' backhanded compliments, dubbing her cute like a dog, left her highly doubtful of her own feminine charm. Resigned to her mediocre fate, she had always assumed she would end up married off to some middle-aged noble with 2 previous divorces. Yet the impossible had happened, suddenly dangling the dazzling prospect of marrying into the luxurious Vroj family with a handsome young husband. Overcome by the spectacular opportunity, Katlia enthusiastically shouted her agreement to marry the Duke. Her excitement faltered slightly when her father nonchalantly revealed that the wedding date had already been hastily finalized. Fast forward to the present, she found herself on the terrifying verge of marrying a powerful duke whose face she had never even laid eyes on. Deep anxiety bubbled within her as she reflected on the sheer absurdity of meeting her groom for the very first time on the actual wedding day. A servant abruptly interrupted her racing thoughts, announcing that the Duke was finally waiting for her inside the room. Jolted back to reality, Katlia nervously braced herself and stepped forward to meet her destiny. Her heart pounded violently with nervous anticipation as she stood before the door, desperately wondering what kind of man waited behind it. Stepping into the grand room, she formally and breathlessly introduced herself as Katlia Bardo to the imposing figure. The sheer gravity of his breathtaking presence instantly commanded the room and completely captured her attention. She was immediately mesmerized by his softly swaying silver hair catching the ambient light. Lord Cryaseld turned to face her, looking as flawlessly striking and unreadable as a marble sculpture. Brilliant sapphire blue eyes pierced through the tense silence, immediately captivating the breathless bride. Overjoyed by his striking appearance, she internally cheers that his legendary handsome features completely exceed the wild rumors. Fumbling through her forced polite introduction, Katlia nervously asks the imposing Duke to take good care of her. He swiftly brushes past her without a single word, completely dismissing her nervous greeting with calculated silence. Reeling from the sudden rejection, she stands utterly frozen as the heavy weight of his absolute indifference crashes down upon her. A soft gasp escapes her trembling lips as the bitter realization of his icy demeanor finally registers. Confusion heavily clouds her expression while she desperately tries to decipher his completely unreadable intentions. Utterly baffled by his blatant disregard, she helplessly questions what exactly just transpired between them. Attempting to fill the suffocating void, she awkwardly explains that only her father and third brother could adjust their schedules for the sudden ceremony. She nervously warns the silent Duke that her fiercely rugged family might severely shock him upon their first meeting. The stoic groom continues to stare blankly ahead, completely ignoring her frantic, desperate attempts at conversation. Stinging from the blatant rejection, she silently agonizes over his outright refusal to even glance in her direction. Frustration bubbling beneath her skin, she quietly wonders if she accidentally offended the unreadable nobleman. An oppressive, suffocating tension heavily blankets the grand hall as her anxious questions remain completely unanswered. Resigning herself to the harsh truth, a quiet sigh of defeat finally escapes her trembling lips. The crushing realization fiercely dawns on her that the powerful Duke harbors zero actual enthusiasm for this arranged marriage. Her father violently barks an order for Katlia to raise her head as the grand ceremony officially commences. Distracted by the Holy Church's breathtaking majesty, she briefly loses herself in the awe-inspiring, sacred architecture. Gazing upward, she solemnly reflects on her lifelong, fervent wish to admire the stunning rose window twice in her lifetime. A rough, forceful shove violently propels the hesitant bride forward down the massive, terrifying aisle. Stumbling slightly, she bitterly grumbles that her muscle-brained family could have been slightly gentler on her highly anticipated wedding day. Struggling against the suffocating constraints of her painfully tight dress, she realizes this dreamlike bridal march feels entirely hollow and emotionless. Echoing footsteps dramatically fill the colossal cathedral as the reluctant bride slowly approaches the towering altar. The massive, intimidating stained glass vividly casts a kaleidoscope of haunting colors across the tense, silent congregation. She tentatively steps forward to stand beside the imposing, silver-haired Duke under the heavy gaze of the holy priest. The stifling, completely unbearable silence between the newly matched couple loudly echoes their vast, unspoken emotional distance. Boiling with hidden rage, she finds it intensely irritating that the man who aggressively demanded this marriage stands there furiously sulking. Defeated by his unearthly charm, she heavily sighs while bitterly accepting that flawlessly handsome men can effortlessly get away with sheer arrogance. Despite her intense irritation, her traitorous heart races violently at the sheer proximity of his breathtaking, majestic presence. Startled out of her deep trance by the priest's sudden question, she abruptly realizes she completely missed the crucial bridal vow. Mentally cursing her own foolishness, she brutally scolds herself for acting like a completely distracted idiot at the altar. Snapping to absolute attention after staring too intensely, she frantically and loudly swears her eternal vows before the holy altar. The priest officially declares the binding vow kiss, prompting the stoic Duke to finally acknowledge the terrifying moment with grim acceptance. Panic completely floods her racing mind as the highly anticipated, terrifying moment of absolute intimacy rapidly approaches. Screaming internally, she brutally braces herself for the absolute shock of experiencing her very first kiss in life. Desperately clinging to her shattered romantic fantasies, she fiercely hopes this singular moment might somehow salvage her heavily mixed feelings. He forcefully leans in, closing the agonizing distance between them as the intense vow kiss dramatically begins. Their lips finally meet in a tense, highly electrifying collision that violently shatters her preconceived expectations of the cold Duke. A blinding, overwhelming surge of raw emotion completely engulfs her as the grand, chaotic wedding ceremony officially seals their undeniable fate. Silence heavily blankets the tense atmosphere as unspoken emotions swirl violently in the quiet, agonizing void. A piercing, unwavering stare abruptly shatters the silence as thick tension rapidly floods the heavy, suffocating air. The agonizingly awkward stillness stretches on relentlessly as silent, heavy judgments are cast across the grand hall. The grand officiant forcefully commands the completely silent, hesitant crowd to offer their congratulatory applause for the newly wedded couple. A firm, startlingly unexpected grip violently jolts the anxious bride as cold reality rapidly crashes back into sharp focus. Katlia yelps in genuine, unadulterated shock as the sudden, painful pressure violently overwhelms her highly heightened senses. An exhausted, heavy sigh completely escapes her trembling lips as the overwhelmingly chaotic wedding ceremony finally reaches its bitter conclusion. Crushed by a massive wave of intense disillusionment, the fierce bride bitterly laments her utterly disappointing, completely lackluster wedding day. Groaning in sheer, agonizing misery, she deeply dreads the incredibly stifling, oppressive atmosphere of the massive Vraj ducal residence. The strict, veteran maid Teresa firmly orders her highly distressed mistress to immediately raise her face with absolute, unyielding dignity. Furious tears rapidly threaten to spill as Katlia bitterly protests the agonizingly awful, deeply unfair state of her own grand wedding party. She fiercely curses her muscle-brained father and brothers for callously abandoning her to manage their remote, demanding territory. To her mounting, fiery outrage, the highly elusive groom completely vanishes into the rowdy crowd to drink heavily with his noble companions. Boiling with righteous, explosive indignation, she desperately craves to storm over and directly confront her excessively negligent, completely absent husband. Teresa patiently reminds her furiously raging charge that the immensely powerful Duke must ruthlessly navigate his strict, mandatory social obligations. A sharp, unforgiving command to immediately straighten her slumping back forcefully snaps Katlia violently out of her bitter, brooding thoughts. Groaning in sheer, unadulterated agony, the highly reluctant bride is brutally dragged back into the endless, agonizingly strict etiquette lessons. She whines pitifully and loudly against the absolutely impossible, incredibly maddening task of memorizing every single noble guest's face and name. The harsh, unforgiving reality fiercely strikes her as Teresa bluntly reveals she will only support the overwhelmed new Duchess for one single week. Teresa ruthlessly critiques her terrible memory, forcefully ordering the fiercely pouting bride to concentrate intensely on the massive, daunting guest list. The relentless, eagle-eyed maid quickly points out the prominent headmaster Safan and the highly influential Count Dankel standing with his elegant wife. Struggling intensely against her limits, Katlia obediently repeats the prestigious names in a desperate bid to forcefully imprint them into her overwhelmed brain. Teresa formally and strictly introduces the legendary sword master Sir Firold, alongside the formidable Lieutenant General Graber and the imposing Sir Robert. Katlia's sharp, highly honed warrior instincts flare instantly as she profoundly admires the flawless, completely impenetrable aura of the master swordsman. Intrigued deeply by sheer, undeniable strength, she attentively notes that the highly formidable Sir Firold stands as a prime candidate for commander. Her calculating, battle-hardened gaze swiftly shifts toward the next highly imposing, extremely powerful male figure towering amidst the grand, bustling celebration. A wild, completely inappropriate urge to fiercely cross heavy swords with her imposing new father-in-law violently surges through her pumping warrior heart. Her rapid breath abruptly hitches as she spots another incredibly handsome, highly distinguished young man effortlessly commanding the vibrant, grand hall. Pure, unadulterated shock violently rocks her entire nervous system as a bewildering, deeply confusing realization suddenly clicks into sharp place. Boiling with fierce, burning jealousy, she loudly curses the gross unfairness of her absent husband fully enjoying himself with such magnificent, strong gentlemen. A remarkably sweet, highly melodic voice suddenly pierces cleanly through the loud background noise, gently calling out to the startled sister-in-law. Katlia scrambles fiercely and awkwardly to compose herself as she quickly recognizes the strikingly beautiful Serenia Vraj, the powerful Duke Kryaseld's younger sister. Absolute awe completely paralyzes the rugged, muscle-brained bride as this ethereal, incredible beauty affectionately and warmly addresses her as true family. The crushing, utterly overwhelming presence of the refined head butler and the dazzling, silver-haired beauty entirely dominates the grand, opulent space. Gracefully bowing her head, the stunningly elegant Serenia warmly offers her sincere, highly radiant congratulations on the newly forged, wildly unequal marriage. Serenia joyfully praises the rugged bride as a lovely, extremely delicate addition, claiming her usually cold brother looks unprecedentedly and completely happy. Katlia violently short-circuits at the utterly absurd, highly unbelievable labels of being called delicate and her completely stoic husband being labeled happy. Deep suspicion sharply flares in her battle-hardened mind as she fiercely questions if these glowing, overly sweet compliments are actually thickly veiled sarcasm. Finding absolutely zero malicious intent in the girl's pure aura, she wildly concludes that the incredibly beautiful Lady Serenia must simply have terribly poor eyesight. Serenia casually mentions that Lord Cryoseld is currently chatting with his noble friends in the small hall. A companion quietly speculates that the missing groom is most likely fraternizing with the imposing knights. Seizing the sudden opportunity, a fiery Catlia enthusiastically volunteers to go scold him and forcefully drag him back. The sharp-eyed Teresa suspiciously questions if the restless bride is merely using the Duke as a convenient excuse to sneak away. Brushing off the accusation, Catlia fiercely resolves to finally confront her new husband about his actual reasons for marrying her. Sneaking cautiously down the grand corridor, she suddenly hesitates upon realizing that violently barging into the room would be incredibly awkward. Peeking quietly around the heavy doorway, the anxious bride carefully spies on the private, highly exclusive gathering. Inside the lavish room, the rowdy noblemen cheerfully raise their glowing glasses to warmly toast their friend's extremely sudden marriage. A curious friend boldly points out the bizarre timing, explicitly reminding the Duke that he always violently swore off marriage. Delivering a crushing blow, Cryoseld coldly admits he merely picked a suitable provincial girl because people relentlessly nagged him. The devastating, utterly heartless confession violently shatters her fragile hopes, leaving the eavesdropping bride completely paralyzed in silent agony. Gasping violently for air, a deeply bewildered Catlia frantically wonders if time itself has miraculously and impossibly rewound. Staring with deep concern, the strict maid Teresa sharply asks the highly disoriented Lady Catlia if she is half asleep. Snapping aggressively back to harsh reality, a wide-eyed Catlia forcefully yells a frantic denial at her deeply confused caretaker. Trembling with terrifying clarity, she vividly remembers that today was supposed to be her highly anticipated wedding ceremony with Duke Cryoseld. Horrific, blood-soaked memories violently flood her mind of being brutally stabbed by a shadow-cloaked assassin on her actual wedding night. Dripping with cold sweat, the terrified bride definitively confirms to herself that she absolutely, undeniably died during that merciless ambush. Gripping her racing heart, she fiercely determines that the excruciating, agonizing pain of her own brutal murder could not possibly be a mere dream. A bystander casually remarks that the flustered bride likely tripped solely because she insisted on wearing terribly unfamiliar, proper shoes. Stepping forward with gentle concern, Ines softly asks the heavily stunned Catlia if she is completely all right. A highly distressed servant quickly bows in frantic apology, anxiously checking if the trembling young lady sustained any serious injuries. Blankly staring ahead, the completely overwhelmed bride struggles fiercely to reconcile her violent past memories with this bizarrely peaceful present reality. Forcing a strained, entirely unconvincing smile, she quickly reassures the terrified servant that the minor stumble is absolutely nothing serious. Walking away in bitter silence, the heartbroken Catlia sadly reflects on the crushing reality that her new husband completely hates her. A polite, highly respectful maid softly calls out to command the deeply distracted madam's immediate, undivided attention. The diligent servant formally announces that it is finally time to fiercely prepare for her highly anticipated visit to the master's room. Jolted violently out of her dark thoughts, Catlia lets out a sharp, highly unexpected gasp of pure shock. She violently recoils as a massive, highly coordinated team of maids aggressively surrounds her to forcefully begin the intense grooming ritual. The determined staff fiercely scrubs, violently brushes, and aggressively polishes the highly overwhelmed bride in a frantic, absolutely dizzying frenzy. Emerging from the completely chaotic pampering session, the exhausted bride stares cautiously at her newly refined, entirely spotless appearance. A massive jolt of realization violently strikes her as she definitively notices this heavily altered timeline is drastically different from before. She vividly recalls that in her previous, tragic life, she hadn't been properly prepared for the fateful wedding night at all. Connecting the bizarre clues, she firmly remembers how her brother Tris previously dragged her there, yet now he remains completely absent. Noticing her heavy, brooding silence, a highly perceptive maid gently asks if something terribly wrong suddenly happened with the imposing Duke. Struggling fiercely to process the wild temporal shift, Catlia vaguely admits she cannot entirely understand what is currently happening around her. A cheerful, highly empathetic maid kindly assumes the deeply silent bride is simply overwhelmed with crippling nervous jitters over her sudden marriage. Leaning in with an entirely mischievous grin, the chatty maid teasingly suggests that having such a famously handsome husband naturally causes intense fear. A sharp, incredibly furious scolding from the strict head maid violently startles the overly chatty Petra into complete, terrified silence. Smiling softly at the mundane chaos, Katlia feels her dark, lingering fears fading slightly, genuinely relieved by the maid's comforting, highly inaccurate chatter. Anxiously pacing, Katlia heavily questions whether the elusive Duke is truly waiting for her inside the master bedroom. She vividly and horrifyingly recalls that in her past life, a black-clothed assassin waited in that exact room. Tormented by dark doubts, she fiercely wonders if the deadly man in black could have actually been the Duke himself. Desperate for the absolute truth, she reluctantly resolves to go confirm whether her bloody demise was simply a prophetic dream. Realizing the immense, lurking danger, she firmly decides that helplessly clinging to a pillar won't save her from a hidden assassin. A composed, highly formal maid respectfully interrupts her spiraling thoughts, offering to personally guide the conflicted bride. The strict head maid firmly steps in, ordering the heavily injured Ines to stay behind and properly rest her foot. Bursting with bright energy, a highly enthusiastic Petra immediately volunteers to take the injured maid's crucial place. Petra helpfully explains that their current location in the West Wing only connects to the central tower on the lower floors. Taking mental notes, Katlia realizes this highly inconvenient, altered route is another glaring difference from her tragic past timeline. Cold dread slowly creeps into her racing heart as she nervously anticipates a sudden, violent ambush from the shadowy killer. Petra cheerfully reveals that Katlia's original room in the central tower simply wasn't finished in time for the sudden wedding. Grateful for the massive distance, Katlia bitterly mutters that her furious screams of hatred for this sham marriage won't reach him. She darkly accepts that if the deadly supernatural phenomenon is proven true, the upcoming confrontation will become an absolute disaster scene. A deep wave of guilt washes over her as she imagines her fierce father weeping over a bloody wedding night tragedy. The heavy, highly intimidating wooden doors loom menacingly ahead as Petra politely announces their arrival at the master bedroom. Suffocating tension violently spikes in the quiet hallway as Katlia sharply steels her battle-hardened nerves for the impending breach. Petra softly calls out to her heavily hesitant mistress, utterly confused by the sudden, paralyzing delay at the threshold. Channeling her warrior father's fierce wisdom, Katlia forcefully reminds herself that hesitation on the battlefield means certain death. Throwing caution entirely to the wind, she aggressively kicks the heavy doors wide open while loudly screaming the Duke's name. Her deafening, highly unrefined shout echoes violently through the grand, heavily shadowed bedchamber. The lavishly decorated room remains completely still, entirely devoid of any shadowy assassins or awaiting husband. Staring deeply into the silent void, the fiercely prepared bride slowly processes the highly anticlimactic, empty reality. Without a single second thought, she abruptly orders a full retreat, leaving the deeply confused Petra standing in absolute shock. Petra desperately tries to rationalize the bizarre situation, politely suggesting the imposing master might simply be deep in slumber. Scoffing loudly, Katlia firmly declares that her booming, mountain-shaking voice would have easily woken the dead. The polite maid quickly offers to ask the head butler for the Duke's exact location, hoping to desperately salvage the night. Rejecting the offer instantly, Katlia stubbornly insists they return to her room to fiercely strategize her very next move. Smiling warmly, Petra kindly promises to prepare soothing tea, gently insisting the master simply had urgent, unavoidable business. Admiring the maid's incredibly sweet nature, Katlia wistfully notes they could have been genuine friends under vastly different circumstances. Arriving back at the West Wing, Petra politely announces their premature return to the heavily closed, silent doors. A dark, suffocating stillness deeply unnerves the battle-hardened bride as the heavy doors slowly creak open into the darkness. Deep confusion sharply pierces her mind as she peers into the suspiciously empty, completely abandoned antechamber. A strange, deeply unnatural shadow completely blankets the usually bustling maid's quarters, sending violent warning signals through her brain. A sickly, overwhelmingly sweet metallic scent violently assaults her highly tuned warrior senses. A horrific, blood-curdling scream forcefully rips from Petra's throat as the absolute, grisly carnage is suddenly illuminated. Katlia stares in absolute, paralyzed horror at the bloodied, violently struck bodies of Harry, Teresa, and Ines scattered across the floor. Spotting a faint, desperate movement, she fiercely rushes toward the heavily wounded Ines lying in a rapidly expanding crimson pool. Kneeling rapidly in the absolute carnage, the desperate bride frantically asks the severely injured maid if she is all right. A thick, suffocating cloud of unknown, toxic smoke violently envelopes the highly desperate bride. She flinches violently as a sudden, unseen danger aggressively strikes from within the thick haze. Coughing violently, she agonizingly notes that her throat and eyes are completely burning with fiery pain. Paralyzed by the lethal fumes, she struggles fiercely just to draw a single, desperately needed breath. A cold, merciless blade violently pierces straight through her fragile back without any prior warning. Blood violently splatters across the dark floor as her completely ruined body ruthlessly collapses. Her vision rapidly darkens as the agonizing, freezing grip of death violently claims her soul. Fading into the pitch-black void, she bitterly questions how fiercely determined her unseen assassins are to brutally use both poison and a sword. A massive, violent gasp forcefully rips from her burning lungs as she suddenly jolts completely awake. Panting heavily in raw terror, she vividly remembers the excruciatingly painful sensation of her brutal, bloody demise. Deeply bewildered by her peaceful surroundings, she wildly looks around the completely intact, highly familiar hallway. The terrifying, absolutely undeniable realization violently crashes into her reeling mind that she had actually just died. The strict maid Teresa fiercely commands the fiercely struggling lady to finally stop violently resisting her duties. Absolute shock completely paralyzes Katlia as she stares blankly at the deeply familiar, perfectly repeated scene. Trembling with heavy dread, she definitively confirms that her horrific, bloody memories are absolutely not a mere dream. Teresa forcefully urges the highly distressed bride to fully accept her ultimate fate and immediately proceed with the important wedding night. Frantically ignoring the harsh scolding, Katlia desperately asks if the completely bewildered maids are entirely unharmed. Groaning in sheer annoyance, Teresa harshly complains that her heavily strained arm hurts from violently pulling the stubborn bride. A massive, overwhelming wave of pure relief completely washes over the highly exhausted, deeply traumatized warrior. Slumping heavily against the cold floor, her battle-hardened mind fiercely begins to desperately process the completely impossible reality. She firmly confirms the terrifying, absolute truth that she is violently repeating this exact same night for the third consecutive time. Analyzing the shifting timelines, she carefully notes that her first gruesome death was a chest stab in the bedroom, while the second heavily involved thick poison and a brutal backstab. A chilling realization violently strikes her that the inescapable time loop always fiercely restarts the exact moment she clings to this specific stone pillar. Desperately seeking logical answers, she wildly wonders if this completely bizarre phenomenon is directly caused by dark magic or a vicious, ancient curse. Despite utterly lacking a clear, definitive cause, she grimly accepts the absolutely undeniable fact of her two previous, highly brutal murders. Feigning a sudden, heavy illness, she urgently begs the highly confused head maid for a brief, desperately needed moment to rest. Calculating her deadly enemy's physical traits, she fiercely deduces the brutal killer is undeniably a heavily built, highly dangerous man. She sharply notes the mysterious assassin possesses elite sword skills and patiently waited inside the completely dark master bedroom. Connecting the highly grim clues, she violently concludes that the highly elusive, famously cold Duke is the absolute most suspicious culprit. Boiling with righteous rage, she heavily assumes her new husband absolutely hated the forced marriage enough to actively order her brutal execution. She finds it completely, absolutely unforgivable that he would falsely propose and then ruthlessly harm the completely innocent serving maids. Igniting with fierce, unyielding determination, the highly trained warrior bride absolutely resolves to make her murderous new husband cry in sheer agony. Distrusting the potentially compromised, highly vulnerable maids, she fiercely decides she urgently needs her heavily armed, entirely capable brother Tris. Carefully masking her highly aggressive intentions, she politely asks Teresa for her powerful brother's exact, current location within the massive estate. A heavy, highly suspicious silence violently and instantly falls over the strictly observant, deeply calculating head maid. Glaring fiercely with absolute suspicion, Teresa bluntly asks if the heavily hesitant bride is actually plotting to cowardly run away from her mandatory wedding night. Frantically waving her calloused hands, Katlia firmly denies running away and falsely claims she merely wants to politely greet her beloved brother. An intense, deeply unnerving stare-down completely locks the two fiercely stubborn women in a completely silent, heavy battle of absolute wills. Relenting slightly to the heavy pressure, Teresa firmly agrees to the minor detour only on the strict, unyielding condition that Katlia fully finishes her bridal preparations first. Amidst the chaotic ambient noise, a mysterious figure stirs in the quiet shadows. Taking charge of the situation, the head maid orders Petra to clean up while instructing Ines to guide the madams safely away. The tension in the air crackles as the servants swiftly move to execute their assigned duties. Ines confidently guides the uninjured madam forward, relieved that she managed to avoid a catastrophic fall this time. Pausing mid-step, the diligent maid turns back to offer further assistance should the madam require anything else. Barking strict orders, she demands everyone disperse immediately and forbids anyone from entering the room until Ines returns. The loyal staff nods in absolute obedience, though a flicker of unspoken confusion lingers heavily in the air. Confirming the estate's layout with absolute certainty, Katlia notes that her brother Tris' room is located exactly one floor below. Pounding on the heavy wooden door, an urgent Katlia demands that her brother Tris let her in to discuss a critical matter. Growing increasingly impatient with the silence, she furiously bangs on the wood and shouts for a quick response. A sudden, thunderous roar from inside demands absolute silence, violently startling her out of her frantic panic. Freezing in her tracks, a deeply confused Katlia wonders if she accidentally targeted the wrong guest room in her rush. Heavy, ominous footsteps echo from the other side as the massive door suddenly swings open to reveal the occupant. Tris breathes a heavy sigh of relief upon seeing his frantic sister alive and completely uninjured despite the commotion. The two siblings lock eyes in a tense, breathless silence that speaks volumes about the night's unfolding chaos. Quickly snapping back to reality, Tris firmly chastises his foolish sister for her incredibly reckless midnight behavior. He furiously questions why she is causing such a massive disturbance in a quiet area reserved entirely for sleeping guests. Brushing off his harsh scolding, a determined Katlia insists that she has crucial information to share immediately. Without waiting for proper permission, she boldly forces her way past him and marches into the dimly lit room. The heavy oak door slams shut with a resounding thud, completely sealing the two siblings inside the quiet quarters. Frustrated beyond all measure, Katlia explodes as she realizes she is experiencing this exact chaotic moment for a second time. Tris aggressively shushes her loud outbursts while demanding to know the whereabouts of her missing new husband. Waving off his pressing question with fierce dismissal, she coldly declares that her husband is completely irrelevant right now. Pushing past the unwanted distraction, she urgently begs her brother to calm down and listen to her dire warning. To her absolute shock, a smooth, unfamiliar voice greets her from the shadows, making her freeze in absolute terror. Narrowing her eyes at the mysterious stranger, Katlia desperately searches her fragmented memory to identify the familiar face. Recognition hits her like a lightning bolt as she realizes this is the incredibly handsome man she spotted at the banquet. Stepping in to clarify, Tris formally introduces the imposing man as Lysel Rosso of the Royal Capital Knights. Lysel smoothly explains that he grew up alongside her husband Cryoseld, sharing years of intense, grueling swordsmanship training. Flashing a blindingly confident smile, the imposing knight officially states his prestigious name for the stunned bride. Bowing slightly with flawless court etiquette, Lysel gracefully apologizes for missing the chance to greet her earlier today. Katlia marvels internally at his elite status and breathtaking looks, completely dazzled by the ultimate royal capital knight. Shaking off her sudden awe, she suspiciously demands to know why such a high-ranking knight is loitering in Tris' quarters. Tris violently shatters her assumption by bluntly revealing that she has actually barged into Sir Laezel's private room. Her brother calmly explains that they bonded at the party and moved their conversation to these quarters after the banquet ended. Tris mercilessly turns the tables, interrogating Katlia about the massive, embarrassing scene she just caused in the rooms above. Burning with absolute mortification, Katlia realizes Laezel's room is directly below hers and that they heard her screaming. A sudden wave of realization washes over her as she remembers Tris mentioning this exact embarrassing detail during her first time loop. While Katlia mentally panics over her ruined reputation, Lysel simply chuckles and praises Tris for having such a lively sister. Decisively wrapping up their late-night conversation, Tris suggests to Sir Lysel that they end things here for tonight. Surprising the elite knight, Tris casually asks if they could exchange rooms for the remainder of the evening. Tris justifies the sudden swap by complaining about the terrible noise his sister is making upstairs and the complete mess in his own quarters. He forcefully insists on the trade, admitting he won't be able to sleep while worrying about his sister disturbing the other guests. Lysel silently processes the unusual request before finally understanding Tris' protective brotherly intentions. Bidding each other a pleasant good night, The two men gracefully conclude their enjoyable evening together while Katlia profusely apologizes in the background. Overwhelmed by her own chaotic actions, Katlia screams internally about how incredibly guilty she feels for causing such a massive disturbance. A heavy, awkward silence settles over the dimly lit hallway as the sheer gravity of her embarrassing situation fully sinks in. The quiet atmosphere hangs thickly in the air while the trio pauses in the immediate aftermath of the awkward revelation. Chuckling softly to himself, Lysel gracefully dismisses the chaos by playfully noting that Katlia is simply at the age for such lively behavior. Snapping back to his strict brotherly persona, Triss ruthlessly chops Katlia on the head for the third time tonight. Exhausted by her endless antics, Triss firmly demands to know the real reason she recklessly barged into the guest quarters. Trembling with genuine terror, Katlia desperately blurts out her absolute certainty that the Duke is planning to brutally murder her. She frantically explains that the Duke finds her troublesome and fully intends to stab her to death in the master bedroom. Clinging to her last desperate hope, she boldly claims that if she and her brother join forces, they can defeat the Duke instantly. Without missing a single beat, a furious Triss delivers a fourth punishing physical chop to his sister's already aching head. He harshly reprimands her for foolishly screaming about her new husband's supposed assassination plot at the top of her lungs. Refusing to entertain her wild accusations, he angrily demands to know exactly who fed her such a ridiculous, unbelievable story. Katlia abruptly bites her tongue, realizing that explaining her third time loop repetition sounds far too unrealistic for him to ever believe. Cornered and desperate, she tearfully begs Triss to trust her own eyes, declaring that he is the absolute only person she can rely on right now. A tense, heavy stare stretches between the two siblings as Triss silently evaluates her manic, terrified plea for salvation. Reading his deeply skeptical expression, a defeated Katlia realizes that her own brother absolutely refuses to believe her dire warning. Accepting her grim fate, she vows to curse him first if she dies, prompting Triss to sarcastically threaten to defeat her himself. Grabbing the muscle-brained idiot tightly by the collar, Triss forcefully drags his loudly protesting sister down the grand corridor. Staring at the ominous master bedroom doors, Katlia violently shudders as she remembers losing her life right behind them during her second repetition. Terrified of her impending doom, she desperately begs her brother to completely abandon the estate and take her back home immediately. Triss completely ignores her cowardly pleas, mercilessly dragging her right to the very threshold of the dreaded execution site. Knocking boldly on the heavy wooden door, Triss loudly announces himself and declares he has come to discuss the pressing matter of his idiot sister. Katlia watches in utter shock, completely bewildered that her brother is actually trying to calmly talk things out with her supposed murderer. Feeling a sudden wave of reassurance, she quickly rationalizes that even the deadly Duke wouldn't dare attack her with her incredibly strong brother present. Noticing the chilling, absolute silence from within the bedroom, Triss calmly deduces that the dangerous Duke must already be deeply asleep. Ignoring all basic court etiquette, the bold knight decisively reaches for the heavy door handles despite never receiving proper permission to enter. The massive wooden doors creep open with a heavy groan, slowly revealing the dark, foreboding expanse of the silent master bedroom. Triss steps confidently into the completely empty room, sharply scanning the shadowy interior for any hidden sign of the missing Duke. Panicking wildly in the doorway, Katlia urgently warns her brother to stay on high alert for a lethal assassin hiding in the dark corners. She frantically searches the empty space, incredibly confused as to why the exact room where she was previously attacked is now completely deserted. Desperate to prove her fatal claims, she frantically checks the walls and floors for any sign of a hidden room or secret passage. Watching her unhinged paranoia run wild, a thoroughly unamused Triss coldly asks if she is finally satisfied with her ridiculous midnight investigation. Utterly baffled by the empty room documented, Katlia struggles to reconcile this peaceful reality with the brutal stabbing and poison smoke from her past lives. Grappling with the chaotic reality of her time loop, Ray realizes the terrifying situation changes with every single repetition. Utterly bewildered by the shifting timelines, she desperately questions why this inexplicable nightmare keeps happening to her. Overwhelmed by the mounting pressure, she screams in pure frustration as she tries to figure out her next survival strategy. Taking absolute charge, a determined Triss orders his sister to follow him so they can track down the missing Duke. Brushing past her intense hesitation, Triss insists they must directly confront the husband to understand exactly what happened. Reluctant to face her supposed murderer, a hesitant Ray whines and drags her feet behind her protective older brother. Stubbornly resisting his firm guidance, she bitterly complains that she refuses to take marital advice from an unmarried sibling. Suddenly sensing a highly lethal presence, Triss fiercely commands his complaining sister to quiet down and step back. Moving with explosive speed, Triss violently shoves a startled Ray completely out of harm's way. Stumbling backward from the forceful push, a highly confused Ray demands to know what her brother is doing. A chilling breeze suddenly sweeps through the dark master bedroom, instantly drawing their attention to the far wall. Scanning the dark perimeter, Triss notes with high suspicion that the large balcony window is wide open at this late hour. Emerging silently from the cold night air, a shadowy, menacing figure steps directly into the dimly lit room. Paralyzed by pure terror, Ray instantly recognizes the deadly man in black cloth from her devastating first life. The masked assassin readies his lethal blade, radiating an intensely bloodthirsty aura toward the cornered siblings. Realizing her fatal mistake, Ray screams in absolute horror as she realizes the killer was hiding on the balcony the entire time. Cursing his own reckless oversight, Triss furiously berates himself for carelessly forgetting to check the outside perimeter. Clicking his tongue in deep frustration, the elite knight swiftly draws his own weapon to face the lethal intruder. Exploding into violent action, the masked assassin lunges forward with a devastatingly fast and vicious sword strike. Screaming her brother's name in sheer panic, Ray watches helplessly as the brutal, high-stakes clash unfolds. Throwing his own body directly into the lethal path, Triss takes the vicious blade to completely shield his vulnerable sister. Coughing violently, Triss manages a weak, blood-stained smile while admitting he is still incredibly happy to have a little sister. Shattered by his ultimate sacrifice, Ray realizes in absolute horror that her beloved brother just took a fatal blow to protect her. The masked assassin mercilessly wrenches his bloodied sword free from Triss' rapidly collapsing body. Blood violently splatters across the dark bedroom floor as the elite knight finally drops heavily to his knees. Reaching out in absolute despair, Ray completely ignores the danger and desperately tries to rush toward her fallen brother. Barking a fierce, final command, a dying Triss orders Ray to get out of the dangerous room immediately. Refusing to abandon her bleeding savior, a sobbing Ray wildly screams her brother's name into the dark abyss. Analyzing his unusually rapid physical decline, she frantically realizes that a normal wound should never take down her impossibly strong brother this quickly. The ruthless assassin chuckles darkly in the shadows, highly amused by their tragic and utterly desperate suffering. A horrifying revelation strikes Ray as she accurately deduces the assassin's cruel blade must be coated in lethal poison. Screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, she desperately begs for someone like Ines to come help them. Forcing out his very last breath, an agonizing Triss fiercely scolds his idiot sister for failing to run away. The masked killer slowly raises his venomous blade again, preparing to deliver the final brutal execution strike. Weeping completely uncontrollably, a broken Ray desperately clings to Triss' rapidly fading body. She begs her dying brother to stay with her as the cold, unforgiving shadow of death fully engulfs them both. The silent assassin brings his heavy sword violently crashing down toward her completely exposed neck. Suddenly bursting into the chaotic fray, a furious rescuer roars that this brutal murder will absolutely not happen on his watch. The heroic newcomer fiercely intercepts the deadly strike, his weapon clashing violently against the assassin's blade to save the terrified bride. The masked assassin raises his lethal blade, preparing to violently strike down the vulnerable siblings. Realizing the immediate danger, a terrified Ray frantically calculates that her fiercely protective brother will certainly be killed. Cutting viciously through the heavy air, the assassin's venomous sword descends in a ruthless, unstoppable arc. Exploding into desperate action, Ray aggressively throws her fragile body directly into the brutal line of fire. The ruthless blade violently pierces her chest, sending a shocking spray of crimson blood exploding into the dark room. Coughing up a massive amount of blood, a shattered Ray violently collapses onto the cold bedroom floor. A horrified Triss fiercely scolds his bleeding sister, demanding to know why she foolishly sacrificed herself to the lethal strike. Barely clinging to her fading consciousness, she weakly begs her agonizing brother to immediately run away. Refusing to abandon him to a cruel fate, she stubbornly declares that leaving her beloved brother behind is completely impossible. A dark, terrifying numbness rapidly spreads through her fragile body as the lethal poison violently invades her veins. Embracing the cold shadow of death, she silently accepts her tragic end for the absolute sake of his survival. Her desperate thoughts abruptly shatter as the overwhelming darkness finally claims her fading life. Standing silently in the bloody aftermath, the murderous assassin coldly observes his devastating handiwork. Shattered by her brutal sacrifice, an agonizing Triss stares in pure horror at his dying little sister. Roaring her name into the chaotic void, the devastated knight desperately curses his own fatal weakness. Slipping away into the endless abyss, Rei silently apologizes to her beloved brother one final time. Drifting through the silent emptiness, she tragically wonders if her desperate final warning ever truly reached his ears. A sudden, blinding burst of pure light abruptly shatters the dark void of her violent death. Transported seamlessly into a warm memory, Rei gleefully devours a massive meal while being reminded her wedding is merely a week away. Shrugging off the mild scolding, she fiercely defends her massive appetite by declaring she must enjoy hearty food while she still can. Agreeing that the royal capital's cuisine is far too refined, her eldest brother Maurice casually watches her ravenous feast. Her second brother, Edgar, sharply warns Maurice that spoiling Rei will only make her dangerously carried away. Blinking in absolute shock, Rei suddenly realizes this peaceful banquet is a vivid memory from exactly 1 week ago. She fondly recalls celebrating with her absent brothers, enjoying the incredibly delicious wild boar Maurice had proudly hunted. Regretting her notoriously tight wedding dress, she bitterly realizes she could have eaten endlessly if she knew time would endlessly repeat itself. A chilling realization washes over her completely frozen mind as she wonders if her entire life is simply flashing before her dying eyes. Staring blankly at the fading familial illusion, she sarcastically demands the universe show her far more moving memories. Snapping violently back to harsh reality, a deeply frustrated Rei realizes the dreaded fourth time loop has officially begun. Stepping quietly down the darkly familiar halls, she lets out a heavy, incredibly defeated sigh. Completely drained by the endless cycle of brutal deaths, she slumps heavily against the cold estate walls. Staring blankly into the empty corridor, she anxiously wonders if her fiercely protective brother Triss somehow survived that bloody final encounter. Remembering his unusually rapid decline, she firmly concludes the assassin's poison must have been incredibly aggressive to fell her sturdy brother. Tormented by tremendous internal guilt, she painfully recounts how her previous loops dragged Teresa and Triss into fatal collateral damage. A paralyzing terror grips her fragile heart as she desperately fears the time loop might permanently break if someone else permanently dies. Steeling her rapidly crumbling resolve, she firmly vows to absolutely never put another innocent life in fatal danger ever again. Stepping smoothly out of the dark shadows, a mysterious voice calmly asks if the lady has finally resigned herself to her grim fate. Blushing furiously in her incredibly conspicuous wedding night outfit, a deeply embarrassed Rei realizes she is completely trapped once again. Refusing to cause any more lethal trouble for the innocent staff, a fully resigned Rei decides to quietly surrender herself to the dangerous Duke. The imposing figure smirks knowingly in the dim light, coldly noting her surprisingly obedient and completely docile behavior. A resigned Rei bids farewell while wondering if she is truly that untrustworthy to the castle staff. Ines fiercely advises the lady to keep absolutely quiet, smile, and carefully listen to the Duke to avoid blowing her cover. Despite the harsh advice, Rei feels a strange sense of familiarity with the maids after repeating this time loop 4 times. She grimly accepts that her upcoming desperate actions will completely destroy whatever fragile trust she has left with everyone. The heavy oak door slams shut with a resounding thud as she boldly sets her new survival plan into motion. Rei suddenly gasps in shock as an unexpected situation instantly unfolds before her very eyes. A sudden, jarring movement in the dark corridor violently interrupts her racing thoughts. Realizing the ruthless culprit is targeting only her and will kill anyone nearby, she resolves to escape the massive mansion completely alone. Panting heavily, a terrified Rei sprints frantically through the long, shadowy corridors of the silent estate. She rapidly calculates that she desperately needs to secure a swift horse to escape far away from this lethal death trap. Disoriented in the massive estate, she urgently realizes she must find a way outside to reach the hidden stables. She suddenly stops dead in her tracks as a chilling realization completely washes over her fragile nerves. Paralyzed by pure terror, she violently flinches as she desperately fears the brutal assassin has already discovered her location. A soft, gentle voice suddenly calls out from the dark shadows, instantly freezing her in place. Rei stares in absolute shock as she instantly recognizes Lady Serenia, the Duke's own younger sister, standing before her. Stammering for a believable excuse, Ray awkwardly claims she was simply touring the castle and got tragically separated from her maids. Mentally kicking herself, she screams internally at how incredibly stupid and utterly unbelievable her improvised lie sounds. She grimly realizes that absolutely no one would believe a new bride is aimlessly touring the dark castle at midnight while completely ignoring her husband. An awkward, suffocating silence violently stretches between the two stunned women standing in the dimly lit corridor. Graciously breaking the heavy tension, Serenia kindly invites the supposedly exhausted bride to talk privately inside her warm room. Completely thrown off by the warm invitation, a deeply bewildered Ray nervously accepts the young girl's hospitality. Pausing her frantic escape plan, Ray cautiously enters the slightly messy room to gather crucial survival information. Scanning the surroundings, Ray notes with mild surprise that the young girl's private room is incredibly simple and surprisingly ungirly. She curiously wonders if this incredibly minimalist room layout is simply the current popular urban trend in the capital. Her sharp eyes immediately lock onto a completely empty, highly suspicious birdcage sitting quietly in the corner. A soft, gentle giggle completely breaks her intense observation as Serenia smiles warmly at her new sister-in-law. Blushing slightly, Serenia cheerfully reveals that this is the very first time she has ever invited someone over at night. Ree's pounding heart violently skips a beat at the young girl's pure, devastatingly innocent expression. Utterly completely captivated, Ray silently screams that her new sister-in-law is dangerously, overwhelmingly cute. Admiring the family's stunning genetics, Ray logically concludes that the Duke's parents must have been incredibly beautiful people. A dark shadow momentarily crosses her racing mind as she recalls hearing their parents tragically died in a suspicious accident 7 years ago. Politely apologizing for the late hour, Ray is quickly corrected when the sweet girl warmly requests a much more casual address. Hesitantly testing the dangerous waters, Ray nervously asks if she can intimately call her Serenia-chan. Beaming with absolute, radiant joy, Serenia enthusiastically confirms the adorable new nickname with a bright smile. Serenia emotionally reveals that her weak body kept her tragically isolated, making her incredibly eager for her new sister-in-law's arrival. A fierce protective instinct awakens in Ray as she furiously curses the fact that a lethal assassin was waiting for her instead of this cute girl. Snapping violently back to grim reality, she nervously wonders if the deadly assassin is still lurking inside the master bedroom. Prying for critical tactical information, Ray casually asks Serenia if her room's location confirms they are currently hiding in the central building. Realizing she has blindly wandered into a highly dangerous territory, Ray fiercely vows to stay fully on guard against impending attacks. Questioning her companion, the young woman curiously asks what kind of person Duke Vraj truly is. Chuckling softly at the unexpected inquiry, Serenia playfully repeats the question about her older brother. She bluntly describes him as a tremendously troublesome, stubborn, and inflexible man who struggles with words and is incredibly hard to please. However, she fondly recalls his deep kindness, noting he stayed faithfully by her side while investigating their parents' tragic deaths 7 years ago. Shocked by this dark revelation, the listener urgently questions if the parents were actually killed in an accident instead. Disregarding the interruption, Serenia explains how he shouldered massive responsibilities alone since inheriting the title at 12, expressing relief that his new sister-in-law will now be there. She smiles warmly, feeling immensely relieved that a woman he truly loves will finally support him through his burdens. Confused by these grand assumptions, the new bride silently questions the bewildering ideas of love and support. Hesitantly, she confesses that the Duke chose her quite casually, fearing she cannot possibly meet these high expectations. Astonished by the claim of a casual choice, Serenia aggressively demands to know who planted such a ridiculous idea in her head. As the bride explains she overheard the Duke discussing it with his knight friends at today's party, she suddenly wonders if her sister-in-law is boiling with anger. Furious on her behalf, Serenia instantly commands that they march to her brother's place to thoroughly interrogate him. Panicking internally, the bride realizes that while Serenia might be safe from the Duke's wrath, she herself will surely perish in the explosive crossfire. Desperate to escape the mansion quickly, she stammers that she checked the master bedroom earlier but genuinely does not know where the Duke is hiding. Trying to deflect by using the late hour as a fragile excuse, she is cut short as Serenia fiercely locks onto the fact that he was not in his room. With absolute, terrifying certainty, Serenia declares she knows exactly where her brother is and forcefully commands the bride to follow. Dragged relentlessly to the third floor of the central building, the bride nervously remarks on how surprisingly pushy the young girl can be. Stopping before a massive set of ornate doors, they pause to question if the elusive Duke is actually waiting inside. Sweating under Serenia's intense, silent pressure, the bride realizes she has no choice left but to enter the room. Resigning to her terrifying fate, she politely excuses herself as she pushes the heavy wooden doors open. The grand doors swing wide open, revealing the shadowy, quiet expanse hidden just beyond the heavy threshold. Stepping inside, the bride is instantly awestruck by the sheer, imposing elegance of the sprawling, magnificent library. Taking in the vast collection of ancient books, the silent grandeur of the massive room momentarily steals her breath away. Her heart plummets as she spots the prime suspect, realizing with absolute horror that the Duke is indeed occupying the room. Glaring intensely from his secluded spot, the Duke coldly demands to know why they have intruded upon his precious solitude. Standing her ground with unwavering confidence, Serenia boldly announces that she personally escorted her new sister-in-law to see him. Deflecting her brother's suspicion about being tipped off by Lysel, Serenia simply states she knew he always retreats here. A tense, suffocating silence settles between the stubborn siblings as they lock eyes in a silent, unyielding battle of wills. Attempting to dismiss her by warning of a looming cold, the Duke is immediately met with Serenia's sharp reprimand about slacking off in the library. Watching the swift verbal parry unfold, the bride mentally panics as she realizes he is blatantly trying to dodge the heated confrontation. Unleashing her righteous fury, Serenia violently scolds him for acting so high and mighty while abandoning his newly wedded wife all alone. Turning his face away to hide his expression, the Duke stubbornly feigns total ignorance, claiming he has no idea what she is talking about. Thick frustration visibly radiates through the vast room as his obvious deflection only further agitates the highly determined young girl. Deciding her job here is definitively done, Serenia abruptly announces she is leaving so the couple can talk things out thoroughly without her interference. Horrified by the sudden, merciless abandonment, the bride mentally screams in terror at the looming prospect of being left entirely alone with her formidable husband. Bidding her a cheerful, unapologetic farewell, Serenia promises they will talk slowly next time as she swiftly makes her brutal exit. The heavy wooden door slams shut with a resounding thud, leaving the terrified bride yelping in complete, helpless shock. Glaring fiercely at the closed door, the Duke mutters dark words under his breath, exasperatedly wondering what exactly they are supposed to discuss. Shifting his intense, piercing gaze back to his trembling wife, he finally shatters the heavy silence by uttering a single, imposing word to her. Sternly questioning his new bride, the Duke demands to know why she was wandering with Serenia when her quarters were already prepared in the West Wing. Explaining her detour, she mentions that Serenia kindly guided her to the library after she got lost, realizing he wasn't in the master bedroom. To his shock, the Duke stammers in sheer disbelief as he realizes she had actively gone searching for him. A tense, heavy silence descends upon the room as the bride carefully scrutinizes his visibly bewildered reaction. Observing his genuine surprise, she quickly realizes that his deeply suspicious demeanor might actually mask a completely different truth. Analyzing the timeline with razor-sharp focus, she deduces that if he truly were the culprit, he would have inevitably visited the master bedroom at least once. Seizing the conversational momentum, she boldly interrogates the Duke about his exact whereabouts and actions immediately following the party's conclusion. Confronted by her fierce gaze, the towering Duke remains eerily and awkwardly silent. Pressing him even harder, she demands to know if he is hiding something while questioning why he is lingering in the library instead of waiting for her. Flustered by her relentless interrogation, the formidable Duke stammers helplessly as he struggles to formulate a coherent response. A bead of nervous sweat drips down his face as he desperately tries to avert his gaze from her piercing, accusatory stare. Regaining a fraction of his composure, he defensively claims he was merely catching up on remaining paperwork and working late into the night. Processing his remarkably weak alibi, she astutely questions if this implies he hasn't stepped foot inside the master bedroom even once today. Connecting the crucial dots, she joyfully realizes that if he never visited the bedroom, it is physically impossible for him to be her mysterious murderer. Sensing no murderous intent radiating from him despite her total vulnerability, she confidently concludes that the imposing Duke is actually telling the truth. A wave of profound, life-altering relief washes over her as she finally accepts that her husband might not be the phantom killer after all. Empowered by this new revelation, she steels herself to ask the Duke a deeply perilous and painfully direct question. Gathering all her courage, she loudly asks him point-blank if he harbors any hidden intentions of killing her. In a blinding flash of black thunder, she becomes ecstatic as she realizes she has finally survived the night's deadly climax. Triumphant and wildly overjoyed, she victoriously celebrates successfully breaking out of the deadly time loop. In a flash, the triumphant atmosphere instantly shatters as a disorienting, sickening sensation abruptly pulls her consciousness away into the void. Blinking in utter confusion, she wakes up deeply disoriented in a terrifyingly familiar, dimly lit room. To her absolute shock, she realizes she has violently returned to the starting point despite managing to avoid her gruesome death. Rushing to her side, her loyal maid Teresa urgently begs the distressed lady to calm down from her sudden, inexplicable panic. Trying desperately to ground her lady in reality, Teresa gently reminds her that their highly anticipated wedding night is just beginning. Staring blankly into the suffocating void, the devastated bride can only utter a trembling sigh as the grim reality of her cursed situation sets in. Analyzing this horrifying new development, she realizes with absolute dread that it is specifically this night itself that is endlessly repeating. Crushed by inescapable despair, she concludes that whether she evades the killer or gets brutally stabbed, the cursed wedding night will inevitably reset. Overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing unfairness of it all, she desperately complains about how truly awful her inescapable fate has become. Falling into despair, she laments being trapped in a ruthless punishment game, hopelessly cycling through a dangerous night with an astronomically high probability of death. Seeking any logical explanation, she mournfully asks Teresa if there is someone out in the world who harbors enough burning hatred to want her dead. Spiraling completely into self-doubt, she tearfully wonders if this agonizing retribution is the steep cosmic price for daring to marry far above her station. Startled by her lady's sudden, dark emotional spiraling, Teresa looks back at her with deep, profound confusion. Regaining a fleeting fraction of her composure, the bride weakly apologizes for spewing such troubling nonsense that only worries her faithful servant. Gently rebuking her spiraling despair, Teresa firmly states that while she doesn't fully understand, the esteemed matriarchs of the family would certainly have something wise to say. A flicker of comforting, bittersweet nostalgia warms the bride's heart as she softly murmurs the respected titles of her grandmother and mother. Channeling the fierce, unyielding spirit of the Bart family, Teresa boldly reminds her that running away from problems or blindly rejecting others is entirely unworthy of their proud lineage. Despite the powerful, resounding pep talk, the terrified bride silently agonizes over what she is practically supposed to do when every single path leads back to this very room. Turning toward her trusted maid with a fragile glimmer of newly forged resolve, she prepares to make her next desperate, fate-defying move. A heavy, pregnant silence blankets the area as unseen forces prepare for the impending confrontation. Swearing her unwavering loyalty, Teresa vows to stand as a steadfast ally if facing the overwhelming challenges proves truly impossible for the young lady. Staring thoughtfully ahead, the resolute bride murmurs Teresa's name as a bold new plan begins to take shape in her mind. Breaking the heavy tension, Teresa gently suggests that they should first try heading directly to the master bedroom. Reading her maid's transparent intentions, the lady internally notes that Teresa likely just wants her to hurry up and get moving. Confronting her own cowardice, she realizes that continually running away and giving up is entirely unworthy of someone bearing the proud Bart family name. Filled with newfound, blazing clarity, she warmly thanks Teresa for finally opening her eyes to the harsh reality of her situation. Declaring her fierce intent to fight head-on as a true member of her lineage, she flatly ignores Teresa's nervous protests that violence is unnecessary. Igniting with righteous fury, she loudly recites the family precepts dictating they must return every fight and relentlessly hunt enemies to the ends of the earth. Berating herself for ever forgetting such vital lessons, she fiercely resolves to face her opponent even if victory seems completely impossible. Reflecting on her grueling upbringing, she remembers how the unyielding philosophy of the Bart family was deeply drilled into her despite her lack of formal martial arts training. Steeling her absolute resolve, she steps purposefully forward to confront the deadly, looming darkness waiting just ahead. Issuing a stern, undeniable command to Ines, she orders her companion to retreat to her room immediately once she enters the dangerous domain. Swallowing her lingering terror, she openly admits she is still scared because the dangerous man in the black cloth is almost certainly waiting inside. Bracing for the inevitable brutal clash, she decides to fight with all her strength while heavily relying on a single, powerful advantage. Pushing the heavy wooden doors open, she boldly crosses the threshold into the dark, foreboding chamber. In a terrifying, explosive instant, a suffocating wave of pure killing intent completely engulfs the shadowy room. A lethal, blinding strike flashes through the suffocating darkness, aimed directly at her vulnerable form. Triumphantly dodging the deadly first strike, she victoriously screams out that she knew the assassin was hiding there. Bursting with raw adrenaline and newly forged courage, she fiercely challenges the shadowy killer to come at her from any direction. The relentless assassin lunges forward with blinding speed, violently forcing her into a desperate, high-stakes evasion. A vicious, unstoppable blade violently cuts through the air, brutally interrupting her valiant attempt at survival. Struck down in the blink of an eye, she collapses helplessly to the floor as the fatal blow violently claims her life. Bleeding out on the cold stone, she frustratingly laments that her desperate, all-out effort was absolutely no good after all. However, a fierce, undying spark of defiance burns brilliantly within her rapidly fading consciousness. Staring fearlessly into the grim abyss of death, she violently vows to return to this exact moment as many times as it takes. Drawing strength from her bloodline, she proudly recalls how her ancestors were wandering mercenaries who ruthlessly presented an enemy general's severed head directly to the king. Rewarded for their brutal, unmatched prowess, her ancestors rightfully earned a title and territory, continuously producing generations of fearsome warriors. Because of this violent, blood-soaked legacy, children born into the Bart family traditionally received elite, grueling warfare training from birth. Flashing back to her youth, a tearful, frustrated younger version of herself demands to know why she cannot hold a sword and become a legendary female knight. Denied the glorious path of the blade, she remembers being sternly instructed to cultivate other talents suited for a proper lady of the modern era. Refusing to be completely sidelined by tradition, she stubbornly watched her older brothers train every single day, absorbing their combat mindset without missing a single crucial detail. Embracing her grim, inescapable reality, she violently awakens as the next brutal time loop completely resets her existence. Anticipating the assassin's precise opening move, she flawlessly tracks the first deadly strike slicing in from the right. Meticulously cataloging the rapid flurry of attacks, she permanently memorizes the exact, deadly sequence striking right, up, left, and left again. Channeling her intense childhood observations, she resolves to analytically dissect the killer's combat habits just as she did in the past. Bolstered by her immense physical endurance, she fully relies on the strong legs, lower back, and boundless stamina cultivated in her harsh countryside upbringing. Locking her unyielding, burning gaze onto the faceless enemy, she formulates a brilliant, foolproof strategy to finally survive the cursed night. With every agonizing, bloody repetition, she vows to perfectly memorize the exact order of the assassin's relentless attacks until she finally claims victory. Refusing to worry about her limited loops, she fiercely declares it her own loss if she fails to uncover the culprit's identity before time runs out. A thrilling tension ignites as she wonders if her loops will expire first, or if she will successfully expose the masked assassin. Embracing the brutal challenge, she fearlessly invites the deadly, high-stakes game of chicken to begin. Trapped in a vicious cycle, she is brutally killed, miraculously resurrected, and then violently struck down all over again. Through the agonizing accumulation of countless deaths, she miraculously learns to dodge the assassin's lethal attacks. Spotting a crucial opening, she expertly tracks the deadly blade's direction as it mercilessly slices through the dark room. The shadowy killer violently presses his relentless assault, forcing her into a desperate, high-speed evasion. Analyzing his rigid tactics, she finds it incredibly strange that he continuously attempts to finish her in a single strike despite her constant dodging. Grasping this predictable, violent tendency suddenly makes the assassin's lightning-fast attacks significantly easier to read. Surviving the relentless onslaught time and time again, she confidently realizes she has completely adapted to the brutal combat. Pushing through the bloody, agonizing cycle, she calculates that she is already battling through her 10th consecutive loop. She meticulously observes that the mysterious man in the black cloth is an absolute master of exceptional, unparalleled swordsmanship. His unpredictable, superhuman movements showcase a ruthless combat style entirely alien to her family's brute strength techniques. Despite her newly forged evasion skills, the piercing physical pain and crushing fear of death still grip her tightly. Refusing to surrender, The boiling, warrior blood of the proud Bart family violently surges through her veins during these life-or-death struggles. Mentally cataloging his attack habits and breathing patterns, she boldly slips back through the master bedroom's heavy doors. Stepping fearlessly into the dark room, she dramatically prepares to dance a violent, high-stakes dance of life and death with her killer. Anticipating the assassin's initial, deadly strike, she flawlessly predicts the vicious blade slashing rapidly upward. The masked killer lunges forward with terrifying, blinding speed, fully intending to extinguish her life in one devastating blow. Letting out a sudden, piercing cry, she intentionally shatters the suffocating silence of their deadly encounter. To her absolute shock, the assassin's lethal sword momentarily falters in midair, genuinely startled by her unexpected shout. Seizing the fragile, golden opening, she boldly demands to know exactly why he is trying so desperately to kill her. Pressing her fierce interrogation, she forcefully asks if someone else secretly hired him to carry out this brutal assassination. Recovering his lethal focus instantly, the ruthless killer violently resumes his deadly assault, nearly cleaving her in two. Barely escaping the fatal, sweeping swing, she quickly realizes that cheap conversational tricks will absolutely not work on this hardened professional. Dodging wildly across the room, she loudly mocks him for wasting such high-level combat skills just to slaughter a weak little shrimp. The masked assassin remains horrifyingly silent, ruthlessly pressing his overwhelming, deadly advantage without uttering a single word. Tripping dangerously during her frantic evasion, a cold spike of pure, unadulterated terror violently shoots through her veins. In that terrifying, split-second moment, she recognizes with absolute certainty that the incoming lethal strike is completely unavoidable. Fueled by sheer, blinding desperation or a sudden heavenly revelation, she executes one final, wildly reckless gambit. Pointing frantically into the shadows behind him, she suddenly shouts Serenia's name into the dark, echoing expanse of the room. Demanding to know why Serenia is standing there, she flawlessly feigns complete, utter shock at the imaginary intrusion. Startled by the sudden, unexpected invocation of the young lady's name, the masked killer momentarily halts his fatal swing. This brief, miraculous window of hesitation grants her the exact, precious split-second she desperately needs to survive the brutal encounter. Exploiting the massive opening, she internally gloats that there is absolutely no way the authentic young lady would actually be wandering around at this late hour. Capitalizing on the childish trick that shattered his lethal focus, she aggressively forces an opening. Bursting forward with blinding speed, she launches herself fearlessly toward the stunned assassin. Desperate to expose his hidden identity, she violently reaches out to tear away the black cloth. The intense, high-stakes struggle rapidly escalates as she relentlessly claws at his dark disguise. A swift, frantic motion violently blurs through the air as the deadly confrontation reaches its explosive climax. Gripping the frayed edge tightly, she forcefully rips the concealing mask completely away from his face. Triumphantly shouting her victory, she successfully strips away the assassin's shadowy veil. The dark fabric flutters to the floor, dramatically exposing the unexpected face of her ruthless attacker. Staring in absolute horror, she completely freezes as her mind violently rejects the impossible truth before her. The revealed face belongs to someone deeply familiar, sending a chilling, paralyzing wave of betrayal through her veins. She instantly recognizes him as the beautiful, charming knight who was happily laughing alongside her older brother earlier today. Trembling with utter disbelief, she quietly whispers Sir Lysel's name as the horrifying reality finally takes hold. Unlocking the terrifying mystery, she acknowledges that his elite knightly background perfectly explains his overwhelmingly skilled swordsmanship. Confusion heavily clouds her desperate mind as she frantically wonders why an esteemed knight would brutally attempt to assassinate her. Regaining his cold, emotionless composure, Lysel mercilessly readies his blade to swiftly finish the bloody job. Apologizing hollowly for the impending kill, he calmly states he holds no personal grudge against her. The lethal, unforgiving blade rapidly descends with terrifying precision to permanently silence her struggling life. Defiant until her very last breath, she fiercely screams that she will absolutely never forgive his ruthless betrayal. Boldly declaring his full name, she celebrates finally unmasking Lysel Rosso despite facing her own violent doom. Vowing brutal, inescapable revenge, she fiercely promises to beat him to a pulp and unleash the true terror of the Bart family. A sudden, blinding flash of brilliant light violently swallows the entire bloody confrontation. Waking in a disorienting, peaceful haze, she shockingly notices the complete absence of the familiar stone pillars. Scanning the terrifyingly empty void, she realizes with mounting dread that everyone else has completely vanished. Standing completely alone in a stark, pure white room containing only a single door, she desperately questions her bizarre location. Frantically analyzing her strange new surroundings, she wonders if the deadly time loop has mysteriously altered its grim starting point. A fragile, desperate spark of hope ignites as she cautiously questions whether the cursed cycle has finally come to an end. Breaking the eerie, suffocating silence, she nervously calls out into the bright, boundless emptiness of the mysterious chamber. An unknown, ethereal voice suddenly reveals that this strange, isolated realm is actually a literal gap in space and time.